What happens when a legendary roastmaster walks into what should be a friendly late-night interview only to discover the host has been secretly harboring a grudge for years? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most shocking moments in late-night television history, where what started as routine promotional banter quickly spiraled into an on-air meltdown that left everyone stunned. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us about the most awkward interview you've ever witnessed. Because trust me, this one takes the cake. Jeff Ross had been making the rounds promoting his latest comedy special, hitting all the usual stops on the late-night circuit. Known for his razor-sharp wit and ability to roast anyone within striking distance, Jeff was typically the guest hosts looked forward to having on their shows. He brought energy, unpredictability, and most importantly, ratings. But when he walked into the studio that Tuesday evening, something felt different from the moment he stepped through those backstage doors. The production assistant, who usually greeted guests with enthusiasm, seemed unusually quiet, barely making eye contact as she led Jeff through the familiar maze of hallways toward his dressing room. The makeup artist, normally chatty and full of behind-the-scenes gossip, worked in near silence, focusing intently on her brushes and powders while avoiding any real conversation. Even the stage manager, typically eager to run through the segment, timing and talking points, seemed rushed and distracted during their brief pre-show meeting. Jeff had been doing this long enough to recognize when something was off. The energy backstage felt thick with tension, like everyone was walking on eggshells around some unspoken issue. But being the professional he was, Jeff pushed those concerns aside and focused on the job at hand. He had stories to tell, jokes to land, and a special to promote. Whatever weird vibe was floating around the studio, he figured it would sort itself out once the cameras started rolling. The show's opening monologue went off without a hitch, the host delivering his usual mix of topical humor and celebrity commentary. To warm up the studio audience, from his position in the green room, Jeff could hear the familiar rhythm of setup, punchline, applause, repeat. Everything sounded normal, professional, exactly what you'd expect from a show that had been running smoothly for years. The musical guest performed their latest hit. The audience responded enthusiastically, and the energy in the studio seemed to be building toward that sweet spot every late-night show aims for. But when the production assistant came to collect Jeff for his segment, her nervousness was even more apparent than before. Her hands were actually shaking as she adjusted her headset, and she kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected someone to jump out and surprise her as they walked toward the stage entrance. Jeff tried to break the tension with some light humor, making a joke about how quiet everyone seemed tonight. The assistant managed a weak smile, but didn't respond, instead focusing on her clipboard like it contained the secrets of the universe, standing in the wings. Jeff could see the host at his desk, shuffling through note cards with an intensity that seemed excessive for what should have been a straightforward interview. The host's jaw was set in a way that suggested he was grinding his teeth, and his usual pre-segment banter with the bandleader was noticeably absent. Instead, he sat rigidly in his chair, occasionally glancing toward the wing where Jeff waited, his expression unreadable but definitely not friendly. The warm-up comedian had just finished getting the audience hyped for the next segment, explaining how excited they should be to welcome the roastmaster himself. The applause was enthusiastic, exactly what Jeff was used to hearing when his name was announced. But as the host began his introduction, something in his tone caught Jeff's attention. The words were all correct, hitting the usual beats about Jeff's career and recent projects, but there was an edge underneath that made Jeff's instincts kick into high gear. Years of performing had taught Jeff to read a room instantly, to pick up on subtle shifts in energy that could make or break a performance. And right now, every fiber of his being was telling him that this interview was not going to go according to plan. The host's smile looked forced, more like a grimace that had been stretched into an approximation of warmth. His gestures seemed mechanical, like he was going through the motions, while his mind was focused elsewhere entirely. As Jeff's name was called, and he walked out onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause and cheers. The familiar rush of performing in front of a live crowd kicked in, temporarily pushing aside his concerns about the weird backstage energy. He waved to the audience, flashed his trademark grin, and made his way over to the guest chair with the confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. But as he reached out to shake the host's hand, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The host's handshake was brief, almost dismissive, and his eyes held a coldness that was completely at odds with his public persona. For just a moment, his mask slipped, and Jeff caught a glimpse of something that looked dangerously close to contempt. It was subtle enough that the audience wouldn't notice, but unmistakable to someone standing right there, experiencing it firsthand. In that instant, Jeff realized that whatever was about to happen, this was not going to be the friendly, promotional interview he had expected. The moment Jeff settled into the guest chair, the host launched into what should have been standard opening banter, but his tone carried an undercurrent that immediately put Jeff on edge. Instead of the usual softball questions about current projects, the host jumped straight into territory that felt more like an interrogation than an interview. "So Jeff, you've built quite a career making fun of people," the host began, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Tell me, do you ever worry that maybe you've crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jeff, veteran of countless interviews, recognized this wasn't the promotional conversation they had discussed in pre-interviews. This was something else entirely, but he handled it the way he always did, with humor and deflection. "Well, comedy is all about finding those lines and then tap dancing right on top of them," Jeff replied, getting a good laugh from the audience. "If everyone's comfortable, then I'm probably not doing my job right." But instead of moving on to lighter topics, the host doubled down, his expression growing more serious. "That's interesting you say that, because I've been thinking about some of the things you've said over the years. Some of the jokes you've made about people who trusted you to be in their presence." Jeff's internal alarm bells were now ringing at full volume. This wasn't random. This was personal. The host was clearly building toward something specific, and Jeff could sense the audience beginning to pick up on the strange energy between them. The laughter from his previous response had died down, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that stretched just a beat too long. "I mean, we all say things we regret," Jeff responded carefully, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "That's part of being human, right? Learning, growing, hopefully getting better at reading the room." "Reading the room," the host repeated, his voice dripping with what sounded suspiciously like sarcasm. "That's a skill, isn't it? Knowing when you've made someone uncomfortable, when you've maybe hurt their feelings, when you've crossed a line. That can't be uncrossed." The studio audience was beginning to sense that something unusual was happening. The energy had shifted from the typical late-night joviality to something much more tense and confrontational. Audience members were glancing at each other, clearly confused about whether this was some kind of planned bit or if they were witnessing something genuinely uncomfortable. Unfold in real time, Jeff leaned forward slightly, his comedy instincts kicking in as he tried to diffuse whatever was building. "You know what? You're starting to sound like my therapist. Should I be lying down for this conversation?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience, but the host's expression remained stony. If anything, Jeff's attempt at humor seemed to make him angrier. "Actually, let's talk about therapy," the host continued, completely ignoring Jeff's attempt to lighten the mood. "Let's talk about the kind of damage that so-called harmless jokes can do to people. The kind of wounds that don't heal just because someone says they were only kidding." Now Jeff was genuinely concerned. This had moved well beyond uncomfortable into territory that felt potentially dangerous for both of them. The host was clearly working through some personal issue on live television, using Jeff as a target for whatever grievance he'd been nursing. Jeff glanced toward the wings, looking for some kind of signal from the producers about whether he should continue engaging or try to wrap this up. "Look, I think maybe we should talk about this off camera," Jeff said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "If I've done something that upset you personally, that's a conversation we should have as human beings, not as entertainment." "Oh, now you want to be human," the host shot back, his composure finally starting to crack in a way the audience could clearly see. "Now you want to have a real conversation. Where was that consideration 3 years ago at the comedy club when you decided to make me the punchline of your entire set?" The pieces were starting to come together for Jeff. 3 years ago, he had indeed performed at a smaller venue where several television personalities had been in attendance. It was the kind of intimate room where comics often engaged directly. With audience members, especially recognizable faces, Jeff remembered making some jokes about various people in the crowd, but he couldn't recall anything particularly vicious or out of bounds. "I honestly don't remember specifically what I said." That night, Jeff replied, trying to be diplomatic. "But if I hurt your feelings, that wasn't my intention." Comedy clubs are different environments than television studios. The expectations are different. "The expectations are different," the host repeated mockingly. "So it's okay to humiliate someone in front of their peers as long as it's in the right venue. Is that your philosophy?" The studio had gone completely quiet now. Even the band members, usually focused on their instruments and sheet music, were staring at the increasingly heated exchange. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every uncomfortable moment as the host's professional facade continued to crumble. Jeff realized he was in an impossible situation. Anything he said could potentially make things worse, but staying silent would make him look guilty of whatever the host was accusing him of. He decided to address the situation head-on. "I think what's happening here is that you're using your platform to settle a personal score," Jeff said, his own voice taking on an edge. "And that's not fair to me, your audience, or frankly, to you. This isn't what professional broadcasters do." The host's face flushed red at Jeff's words. "Professional. You want to talk about being professional? Let me tell you what's professional. Making someone feel small and worthless in front of a room full of industry people who determine their career prospects." "I roast people for a living," Jeff responded, his patience clearly wearing thin. "That's literally what I do. If you came to one of my shows, you knew what you were signing up for. And if you had a problem with something I said, you could have called me the next day like an adult instead of ambushing me on live television." The exchange had now crossed into territory that was clearly beyond what anyone had planned or expected. The host was breathing heavily, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Jeff was leaning back in, his chair, his body language, defensive but alert, like someone preparing for a potential physical confrontation. The host stood up abruptly from behind his desk, his chair rolling backward with enough force to bump into the backdrop. Jeff remained seated but visibly tensed, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as he watched the host's breakdown unfold in real time. "You know what the problem is with people like you?" the host shouted, his voice echoing through the studio, with a raw intensity that made everyone present uncomfortable. "You think because you call it comedy, you can say whatever you want about anyone. You think hiding behind punchlines gives you permission to destroy people." Jeff had seen enough. This had gone from uncomfortable to genuinely concerning, and he wasn't going to sit there and be berated on live television by someone. "I'm not doing this anymore," Jeff said firmly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent studio. "This isn't an interview, this is therapy, and I'm not your therapist. If you want to work through your personal issues, do it on your own time." The host's response was immediate and explosive. "Don't you dare walk away from me. You don't get to just leave when things get uncomfortable." That's exactly the kind of coward behavior I'd expect from someone who makes a living punching down at people. Punching down, Jeff turned back toward the host, his own anger finally starting to show. "I've been in this business for decades. I've roasted presidents, celebrities, people way more powerful than either of us. I don't punch down, I punch in every direction equally." "Equally," the host laughed. "But there was no humor in it. You made jokes about my divorce, about my kids, about things that had nothing to do with comedy and everything to do with causing pain. And you did it in front of people who could make or break careers in this town." The studio audience was now completely silent, many looking around nervously as if expecting security to intervene at any moment. The band members had stopped pretending to focus on their instruments and were openly staring at the confrontation unfolding just feet away from them. Several audience members in the front rows looked genuinely frightened by the intensity of the exchange. Jeff shook his head in disbelief. "If you had problems with specific material, you should have addressed it like a professional. This ambush, this public meltdown, this is not how adults handle disagreements. Adults, the host's voice cracked with emotion. Adults don't make jokes about custody battles and failed marriages to get cheap laughs from strangers. Adults don't turn someone's personal pain into material for their comedy routine. And adults don't hold grudges for 3 years and then explode on live television," Jeff shot back. If what I said hurt you that badly, you had countless opportunities to reach out and have a conversation. Instead, you chose to make this public spectacle. The host moved out from behind his desk, closing the distance between himself and Jeff in a way that felt genuinely threatening. The studio's security personnel, who had been watching from the wings, began moving closer to the stage area. "You want to know why I didn't call you?" the host's voice was now, trembling with rage. "Because people like you don't care about the damage you cause. You just move on to the next victim, the next easy target, the next person whose pain you can mine for material." Jeff stood his ground as the host approached, but his body language made it clear he was prepared to defend himself if necessary. "This is insane. You're having a breakdown on national television because of jokes I made 3 years ago at a comedy club. Do you hear how that sounds? It sounds like someone finally calling you out for your toxic behavior," the host replied. Now standing just a few feet away from Jeff, "It sounds like someone refusing to let you hide behind the comedy excuse anymore." The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Audience members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, many looking toward the exits as if considering whether they should leave. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of what was clearly going to be one of the most talked about moments in late-night television history. Late television history. Jeff looked directly into the host's eyes, his voice steady. "Despite the chaos surrounding them, the only toxic behavior I see here is a professional broadcaster using his platform to settle personal scores. This is abuse of power, plain and simple." Those words seemed to push the host over the edge. His face contorted with rage as he raised his hand and pointed directly at Jeff. "Get out. Get out of my studio right now. Security, escort this man off the premises immediately." The security team, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of directive, quickly moved onto the stage, but Jeff held up his hands, indicating he would leave voluntarily. "Don't worry, I'm going." This is exactly the kind of unprofessional behavior that ends careers. As Jeff walked toward the stage exit, the host continued shouting after him, his voice now hoarse from the emotional outburst. "Don't ever come back here. Don't ever think you can show your face on this show again." Jeff paused at the edge of the stage and turned back one final time. "Good luck explaining this to your network executives. And good luck explaining it to your audience who came here expecting entertainment, not a therapy session." With that, Jeff Ross walked off the stage, leaving behind a studio full of stunned audience members, a host who was visibly shaking with rage, and cameras that had captured every second of one of the most shocking confrontations in late-night television history. The host stood alone on his stage, breathing heavily. Studio lights. That's the story of how one of comedy's most experienced roastmasters found himself kicked off a major late-night show after a confrontation that revealed more about the host's character than anyone could have imagined. What do you think about situations like this, where personal grievances spill over into professional settings? Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible behind-the-scenes stories from the world of entertainment.